Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. We're excited. We're excited to have you first on what is a rather snowy evening here in UMaine. I should say, actually, a good afternoon, as the case may be, where you are. I think we have a number of folks from the West Coast joining us today as well. So, yeah, welcome. We'll go ahead and get started with a brief introduction of our speaker. So this evening, we're honored to be hearing from Rabbi Beth Lieberman, who was part of the team, is part of the team working on the forthcoming JPS TANAKH gender-sensitive edition. Rabbi Lieberman does a number of things in California. A list so long, I'm afraid to even start because I'm going to leave out important things. Active online, has a website. You can find out more about Rabbi Lieberman there. Maybe I'll share that in a moment via the chat. This evening, she's going to take us on a tour through the history of Jewish translations of the Hebrew Bible and give us a kind of glimpse into the thought process that has gone into the translation and revision process for, again, as I said, the JPS gender sensitive edition. We'll take questions at the end of her talk this evening. The way we'll be doing that is basically if you can just raise your hand. There's a function in Zoom for this, or honestly, just actually raise your hand and wave. Yeah, frantic waving usually works. I'm getting reasonably good at spotting these things these days. So if you have a question you'd like to ask at that point, just let us know. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Rabbi Lieberman.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Michaud, for inviting me to be here, all the way from Southern California, where we are expecting a storm, but it is not the same weather that Maine is having, for sure. Thank you, Norman Minsky, founder of the university's Judaic Studies program, for this opportunity to share the historical work of this project. And thank you all for being here tonight. It is probably snowing where you are also, or raining. Our subject for discussion puts me in mind of Burton Throckmorton, who some of you knew as a beloved mentor, colleague, and friend. His work as a scholar translating scripture into inclusive language and then going out and explaining why he did it was an inspiring model for others who value making sacred texts accessible. I feel truly blessed to be aligned in some way with Professor Throckmorton's intellectual and spiritual efforts. The structure of this talk will be as follows. We'll look at the Hebrew Bible in general terms, then delve into a few specifics. We'll examine the circumstances and the historical context for an adapted translation. We'll peek into the process of changing the rendering of God's name. And finally, we'll examine samples of the work as it appears in the soon-to-be-released JPS TANAKH Gender Sensitive Edition. First, I'd like to share a brief story about me, namely how I got into this work. I am what is called a scholarly rabbi. I am also a longtime professional book editor, 500 published books to my credit. When JPS approached me, about adapting their existing translation, what immediately came to mind was the cultural significance and the immense challenge of such an endeavor. I was honored. I am absolutely devoted to Jewish texts and to their centrality to the ongoing conversation from generation to generation. And I have an unquestionable commitment to hearing the Kol Damama Daka, the voice of slender silence, as it is masterfully rendered by poet and liturgist Marcia Falk, the mystery that is God, and the inclusion of marginalized voices in our discourse. Dayenu, that would have been enough. But I've been involved with publishing books for a long time, and as anyone who works in that industry knows, it is a badge of honor to have a hand in the publication of a bestseller. So, of course, when the opportunity was presented to me to spend several years working on some of the best-selling books of all time, well, I couldn't say no. Now, whether or not you study the Bible or even read it much, the Bible is, as the novelist Marilyn Robinson has written in the New York Times, the model for and subject of more art and thought than those of us who live within its influence, consciously or unconsciously, will ever know. You are here, at least in part, because you already believe that the language of Scripture is important. So let's get into that by first defining what Scripture we're talking about. Yes, the Hebrew Bible slide. The Hebrew Bible, known to many around the world as the Old Testament, is referred to in Jewish communities as Tanakh, standing for the tripartite canon of Torah teachings, Nevi'im, prophets, and Ketuvim, writings. It consists of 24 books and was canonized somewhere around the 1st to 2nd centuries of after the Common Era. It is a remarkably diverse collection of texts in varying genres, composed over thousands of years, multiple geographical regions, societies, and cultures. Examples of this range from the Exodus narrative, likely to have occurred in Canaan and Egypt in the 13th century BCE, to the words of the prophets who lived during the Babylonian exile and Persian period, to the Song of Songs, composed in the 4th and 3rd century BCE, yet derived from earlier Sumerian literary traditions, to the Book of Psalms, which, according to Robert Alter, served as one of the primary models for lyric poetry in the Western tradition, and which were composed over a period of 500 years. To quote my teacher, Rachel Adler, the vastness of the time span we're talking about is equivalent to the period between Beowulf and Zadie Smith. The Hebrew Bible, as the Old Testament, has been translated into languages throughout the world to serve as bookend to the New Testament, but these are not the translations I will be discussing. The specific type of Hebrew Bible translation we're talking about is a Jewish one. Hence, this list, what characterizes a Tanakh translation or Hebrew Bible translation that is called Jewish? You can see a few of the characteristics of one. I think most notably, it's important to know which texts we're talking about and what Hebrew the Bible is based on. And it's kind of interesting to know that they're published in a particular way. So they look a particular way, often side by side Hebrew and English, not always though. The Hebrew Bible is read, chanted, excerpted in Jewish liturgical settings and studied in academic settings in one or both languages, Hebrew and the vernacular of its milieu. So the next slide is languages of major Hebrew Bible translations. These are just the most major ones. The Hebrew Bible has been translated in whole or in part into languages of the societies that had at one point or another substantive Jewish communities. Oh, I want to go back and just say, we don't have to go back to the slide, but I want to say that another important point of a Jewish Bible translation is that it uses the commentaries of Jewish scholars over a period of centuries, and it's either exclusively or largely, and that does result in a number of differences in the translation. So now we can see the last entry is English. That was British English for the British population, and also English for the American population. So we're now going to train our focus on translations for the American Jewish community. The American Jewish community has no supreme body and also is represented by multiple denominations, each of whom differ significantly from the others in practice and belief. So when in 1917, the Jewish Publication Society put together a cross-denominational team to produce a Bible for this community, it was impressive and the first of its kind. This translation, which was a predominantly word-for-word rendering of the Hebrew, was strongly influenced by the English style of the King James. It served as the standard translation of the American Jewish community for many decades. In fact, I still have the 1917 edition of my family's Bible, which has everybody's handwriting in it. It's very cool. So in 1955, it became time to revise the 1917 translation, and another multi-denominational team got together to produce it. Its title was the New Jewish Publication Society Tanakh. It's known by scholars as NJPS, which is what I'm going to call it. NJPS took 30 years, folks, to be published in its entirety. Rather than a word-for-word translation, this translation was written in contemporary English idiom and guided by centuries of Jewish commentaries and current Bible scholarship. But there must have been a lot of committee meetings for it to take so long. This translation became iconic and was adopted for use in academic and institutional settings throughout America and the English-speaking world. No one in their right mind makes light of the task of adapting the NJPS. But this is exactly the task that our team set out to achieve. So then this slide is an excerpt from the Modern Language Association Council on scholarship. I think it's very important to keep in mind, and it provides us with a guidepost in looking ahead at what we're going to be looking at. Every translation is an interpretation. Each one begins with a critical reading, then expands and ultimately embodies that reading. The principles that our team used were similar to the NJPS, but the results look different. I mean, it is 2023 after all. So yeah, not ready for that next one yet. Let's stay on the MLA for the moment. Thank you. What was our critical reading? Well, in order to answer this, it is important to note two seismic changes that have occurred in the nearly 40 years that have passed since that translation. The first has been language. The English language has changed so deeply in the past few decades that in the United States, lexicographers, linguists, and literary scholars by and large agree that the male is a false generic. What this means is that the word he is no longer accepted in formal writing as a generic pronoun. and mankind is no longer accepted in formal writing as a universal noun. Now, we're not even talking email. We're talking formal writing, publications. This is style now. This is language style. Furthermore, since English contains gender-neutral pronouns such as they, them, theirs, you, yours, it, there is simply no way to justify this method of translating our texts anymore. Now I'm ready for the next slide. Thank you. There is the matter of God's gender. Whether the Bible's composers intended to depict a deity whose persona is beyond society's gender categories is a matter of long-standing debate in academic circles. This is on a slide in front of us because this is in the preface to the new translation. Not everyone's going to like this. It's still being debated and probably always will be. Yet, almost every major English language translation of the Hebrew Bible in the past 40 years, that is, since the NJPS was first published, almost every major translation by individual translators and single denominational translation teams, with a single exception, a partial translation for the Reform movement, these have all retained the following designations for the God of Israel: the Lord God of history, he who took us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, he whom we are commanded to love, serve, and worship, he whose presence fills the earth, and so forth. For many of us, these sound just fine. Yet, for others, using the text, and myself included, using the text with the standard male designations for God makes reading the Bible not only seem distancing, it makes it seem idolatrous. It requires us to take extra steps in order to imagine our way into the narrative, or to find ourselves in conversation with God as we struggle to add our presence and our perspective into the text. In 2023, gendered God language is a hindrance. For quite a while now, liturgists have been composing alternative language for use in prayer. They've been leading us in this. Yet now it is time that a widely read translation of the Hebrew Bible reflects this. So another quote from the preface is this, quote, "The God language in this edition respects the fact that the Hebrew text does not allow us to determine exactly what its composers themselves believed about the gender of God's persona." So now let's add another layer. What else happened? We can stay on the tetragrammaton. We can stay on the tetragrammaton, I guess. Yeah, thank you. The second seismic change that has occurred is the advancement of scholarship and research in the areas of Israelite history and religion, Bible, literary studies, philology, linguistics, and the social sciences. This has altered our understanding of Israelite family life, men's and women's religious beliefs and practices, women's distinct literary genres, and more. And so this first Jewish gender-sensitive translation of the full Hebrew Bible, titled the JPS TANAKH Gender-Sensitive Edition, which we're going to call our JPS, RJPS renews and revises the 1985 edition to reflect these advances in scholarship and changes in English, while maintaining fidelity to the original Hebrew. Did we have another slide before? Can we just check, Derek, this slide before the Tetragrammaton? I think there might be. Ah, yes, thank you. This is it. Thanks. So what this is saying is that there are a lot of changes in here having to do with labels and pronouns for people as well as for God, and other I'm not going to be able to talk about it all tonight. In fact, what will remain outside the scope of my discussion tonight is the references to persons that are gender sensitive yet consistent with ancient gender norms, and the way the translation has strived for inclusive language when referring broadly to people and ancestors in humankind. And this is why, because I had a particular focus, and my focus was this: the revised team was composed of a literary editor and 3 Hebrew Bible scholars, one of whom is a linguist. That's David Stein, the project lead, whose name you should know if you don't already. He's been working on the JPS TANAKH for decades. 2 of the 4 of us were rabbis, and 2 of the 4 of us were female identifying. I had 2 distinct roles, one as a revising translator, with the laser-focused task of rendering the God language gender neutral, and the other as the project's literary editor. In this capacity, I sought to ensure that all the adaptation work our team did retained the style and poise of the 1985 edition phrasing. The intersection of those 2 roles is what we're going to talk about next. So now I'm ready for the Tetragrammaton slide. So let's talk about God's name. The God of the Hebrew Bible has a personal name, but we don't know what it means or how to pronounce it. The most widely accepted explanation among scholars connects this name with the Hebrew verb haya, to be, represented by the letters Yud He Vav He. God's name is also known as the Tetragrammaton, and it appears nearly 7,000 times in the Hebrew Bible. Ever since the days of the Second Temple, Jewish tradition has forbidden anyone from pronouncing the Tetragrammaton aloud. All we say now, 2 millennia later, is a substitution. Can we have the next slide, please? These stories taken from the Talmud are by Rabbi Mark Samus' excellent History of the Tetragrammaton, the name. As you can see, they are absolutely fabulous. Talk about people being levitated, being swallowed by trees, creating a human being, much like a golem, and even an interpretation of what happened when Moses saw the Egyptian beating the Hebrew, and an interpretation of what actually might have happened. So these are stories by the rabbis of the Talmud. This is much of what we have. Plus commentators, have written about this over time. But we don't know. Somewhere along the way, the Jewish scribal tradition established an alternate substitution of God's personal name, That substitute is Adonai, which was translated into Greek as Kyrios, Lord. What we read today, Adonai in Hebrew, which means my Lord, and Lord are derived from that. But they are only substitutions for the unpronounceable, ineffable name of God, which is as unknowable as the divine presence itself. English language Bible publishers have a long history of substituting the Lord for the Tetragrammaton. It has been the near universal choice. Okay, I'm ready for the next slide. Thanks. Yet the translation team's task was to represent God's ineffable name in a form that would resonate with English-speaking communities while conveying a sense of mystery, power, holiness, and dynamic change. In 2006, during the creation of a gender-sensitive Torah translation that served as prototype for our project and also was published by the Reform Movement. During the creation of this, David Stein and then JPS editor-in-chief Ellen Frankel asked a number of scholars and rabbis this question: what kind of representation for the Tetragrammaton would work best? 15 years later, we asked the question again to another group of scholar and rabbis. And here's what we heard. There is no solution that is good and that is universally acceptable. So where do we go from there? We knew that Lord had to go. I mean, as you can see from the definitions, is it, I hope it's legible and big enough, or barely. The definitions of Lord from the unabridged Merriam-Webster, are as a title and a noun is used for males. It seems pretty clear. So the Jewish Publication Society felt it would be best if we were to employ two strategies: to follow in the footsteps of Samson Raphael Hirsch's approach, who in 1867, in his German language translation of the Hebrew Bible, represented the Tetragrammaton as God in German and gave it a typographically distinctive treatment. The second strategy was to follow in the footsteps of Moses Mendelssohn, who in his German language Torah translation represented Yud He Vav He as the eternal in German. If I could pronounce it, I would say it, but I can't. So finally, let's look at the text together. Let's look at how the gender of God shifts in the text in a few examples from the JPS TANAKH, the gender sensitive edition. So we're going to start with Exodus 15, verse 21. As you can see, there are two verses up on the slide. The first, verse 20, is changed from one version, the 1985 version, to the next, the 2023 version, but it doesn't have to do with gender, so I'm not going to highlight it. But if you can pick it out and you want to ask a question later, please do. For the second, verse 21, the 1985 edition reads, "And Miriam chanted for them, 'Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver he has hurled into the sea.'" What it will be in the new edition is, "And Miriam chanted for them, 'Sing to God who has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver have been hurled into the sea.'" If you have an opinion about it, you want to jot it down and tell us later, that's always great. The idea was to make it barely perceptible, to stay with the general style, yet to do it according to all of the criteria that I outlined. Okay, for the next slide. Next slide is from Deuteronomy 11:13. This appears as part of the Shema in Jewish liturgy, the 1985 edition. If then you obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, loving the Lord your God and serving him with all your heart and soul. I mean, beautiful, of course, but 2023, if then you obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, loving the eternal your God and rendering service with all your heart and soul. That's what it's going to look like. Okay. For the next slide, I'd like to look at Isaiah 2:4. This is a passage many of us know from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's speeches and many others. 1985 edition. Thus he will judge among the nations and arbitrate for the many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not take up sword against nation, and they shall never again know war. The new 2023 edition is going to read very similar, just one small change. Thus, God will judge among the nations and arbitrate for the many peoples, and so on and so forth. So let's go to another passage from Isaiah. This appears in Jewish liturgy as part of the Kedusha. It's got a nice rhythm to it. It's got a wonderful rhythm to it. So 1985, in the year that King Uzziah died, I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the skirts of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs stood in attendance on him. Each of them had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his legs, and with 2 he would fly. And one would call to the other, Holy, 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 the Lord of hosts, his presence fills all the earth. The new edition will read, in the year that King Uzziah died, I beheld my sovereign seated on a high and lofty throne, and the skirts of God's robe filled the temple. Seraphs stood in attendance, each with 6 wings, 2 covering the face, 2 covering the body, and 2 to fly with. And one would call to the other, Holy, 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 God of hosts, whose presence fills all the earth. This one was very tricky, by the way. This took a number of conversations to figure out. So this is, for the slides, this is it for the moment. We'll have some bonus ones for maybe later, we'll see, for Q&A. But what I'd like to leave you with is that I believe that our JPS, the new edition, is poised to become the Bible translation of choice for readers who embrace biblical scholarship and reverence to tradition, and who embrace an inclusive perspective in their theology and their spirituality. Why does this matter? Well, I ask you that question. We are all looking for ways to maintain authenticity while opening the text to the next generation. You are the first audience to see these excerpts from this soon-to-be published work. So you are very special for that reason. You're very special anyway, but I would love to hear your thoughts and your questions.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rabbi. Yeah, we'll open it up to questions and comments. Yeah, Rabbi Lerner, go ahead.
Well, thank you. That was wonderful. And thanks for sharing those. And on the one that you said there was another change, if we caught it, I noticed the switch from Miriam the prophetess to the Miriam the prophet. So my question is, with the word sovereign, we've been using it in the Reform movement in a lot of contexts. So for a lot of people, it's very comfortable, it's recognizable, it's already in the lay of the land. But I was wondering, was there any testing of that actually feeling gender neutral, gender sensitive? Because while the word technically is and doesn't have the same masculine heft that Lord does, there's still a part of me that I realize it feels like, not that I have a replacement word, by the way, wouldn't volunteer that, above my pay grade, but I'm just kind of curious if other people in your study found that word still skewing a bit.
Kol hakavod for catching prophetess to prophet. There's another one in there too. And an excellent question. Sovereign. I mean, there are many people for whom this will not go far enough, first of all, because we are faithful to certain theological concepts and scholarly concepts that we are not willing to give up. It's sovereign didn't strike. I mean, it's not as familiar to people as some of the other terms for royalty, but it was the best alternative. And you know what we're hoping is that people will get used to it, like they get used to seeing, you know, women in positions of this and that, rabbis. And so rabbi won't necessarily mean a guy with a beard, although of course it can mean a guy with a beard. So yeah, that was not an easy one.
So, Rabbi, there's a couple of questions that have been sent in via the chat that I'll just ask you myself. For one, on one of your slides, the word God was in brackets, and it was the one change in that passage, I believe from a hymn to a God in brackets. Why was that? What's up with the brackets?
Yeah, those brackets, they're kind of distracting, but the way that the translation that it worked is that when it was the tetragrammaton by itself, it appeared as God in small caps. When it was a reference to God, but didn't actually have God's name in it, one of God's names, because there are several, and there are several epithets too that God goes by, and those take some finessing as well. Then we don't put the word God in when it doesn't exist in the Hebrew text. That's part of being as faithful, disciplined. Being faithful and disciplined in terms of the translation.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Beth, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. So what you just said might be the answer to the question I had. In the verse you shared, and I'm sorry, I don't remember if it's Isaiah or not, but where it's horse and driver, the horse and driver have been hurled into the sea. So the translation, the shift in translation becomes passive rather than active. And so I wondered why not use God. God has hurled the horse and driver into this, her horse and driver God has hurled into the sea. Is it again because of what you just said about God's name not being there?
In this particular case, God's name wasn't there. So it was horse and driver, he has hurled into the sea. Now, of course, it was it's difficult to take out to change. You don't want to change the meaning that this is what God did, that this was active. However, sometimes it just didn't sound good to put God in brackets. So we had to balance, we had to strike a balance throughout the texts. So that the reading experience would be as clear and sound as good as possible.
If I could just add, I am really thrilled by this. I have to say that I'm someone for whom the gendered language has been a real obstacle for a long, long time, and I just really appreciate translations that address that and make it more available to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. So again, another question that's come in via the chat from Melissa Langham, the Associate Dean of our Honors College here at the University of Maine, asks if you can speak to what made the last change that you spoke of, so that last passage, particularly challenging, and what exactly about that passage compelled so much discussion? If you could just
Sure.
round out our understanding on that a little bit.
Absolutely. Should
I
we
believe
look
that was the
or-
Isaiah 6, right?
is it possible to look at the slide when we're doing this, or?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay.
It'll
Slide
take a
number
second.
15.
Oop,
No, not that one.
there we go.
Okay. You got to peek at Proverbs 31, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
So what the primary challenges with this one were the serifs, because the serifs were also, and this isn't about God per se, but yet it's all related, that they were, the way that the pronouns are working, each of them had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his legs, with 2 he would fly. Do you see that, like, the he is not capitalized? So it's referring to, we're not really sure, it's ambiguous, and so we wanted to keep it ambiguous without throwing a bunch of pronouns in there, and came up with seraph stood in attendance, each with 6 wings, and changing the verb form. The tense, 2 covering the face, 2 covering the body, and 2 to fly with. It was that was tough. If you might also be thinking about actually, the Lord of Hosts to the God of Hosts. So Adonai Sabaoth appears so many times in the Hebrew Bible, and sometimes it's part of a longer string of a name, and sometimes it appears by itself, and we had a lot of discussion about that, because what are Savaot? And this is kind of like an extra piece on this. We decided not to go out and do anything crazy and call the hosts, which I thought were gendered, because they're often looked at as armies, and that's how Robert Alter translates them. But they can also be the heavenly bodies that have to do with sort of a syncretism of earlier religions. How much do you want to acknowledge that? So we ended up keeping hosts. There you go.
I have a question.
Sure.
Hi, Rabbi Lieberman. I'm David. We studied together in AJR. I don't know if you remember.
Yes. Hello, David. It's nice to see you.
Good to see you. I was excited to hear what you've been working on. Kol hakavod to you as well. And this is really fascinating. And I was wondering two things. One, what did you do with places, let's say in Genesis 2, where the words Yud Hey Vav Hey and Elohim are put together? For example, I was just looking Genesis 2:9, Vayita Adonai Elohim Gan Be'eden, so it's and they're together. So did you just omit one of them? And along that too, one of the always fascinating things reading the Hebrew text is when is one name used for God versus other, when Elohim versus Yud Hey Vav Hey is used, and of course that has come to be associated with whether it's midrash or Kabbalistic ideas or one name versus the other. I assume that there's still a consistency where someone could know, oh, this is really a place where Elohim was used versus Yud Hey Vav Hey. But those are my two questions.
Okay. There is a consistency. We have and we've got charts of all of it, very meticulously recorded, that Adonai Elohim became eternal God, or the eternal God. Adonai Elohecha became the eternal your God. Adonai Eloheinu, the eternal our God, and so on and so forth. So the eternal, and that's primarily where the eternal was employed with Elohim. But it was also employed in places where Yud Hey Vav Hey appeared twice in this, in close proximity, 2 places in close proximity. So.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for these questions are great, and they're jogging my memory about all these potentially really challenging passages. Go ahead, Ned Beach, with your hand raised there.
Well, yes, thank you. I was wondering about how thoroughly it could all be gender neutral, or is some gender bias still going to be seeping in from time to time? For example, I'm thinking about God saying, you shall offer your firstborn to me. As a firstborn, the assumption, I think, has been that the firstborn would be the first male child born shall be offered in the temple. But maybe, is your version going to have it be that maybe it would be a girl? If the girl was born first, then the girl would be offered. But that seems to be almost changing history, because back then they were kind of male biased.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in an instance like that, and I'm only speaking about this because I can answer this directly. There are many other issues having to do with people and community, terms that my colleagues would need to answer, who are not with me right now. So, but our team adhered to the normative scholarship as to what Israelite society was like. So obviously the normative scholarship now is different from what it was like in the 50s. However, this particular instance, the example that you're mentioning, we didn't change that. That would just be changing. It wouldn't be warranted. Part of the gender sensitivity is that we changed what could be changed and remain accurate according to scholarly consensus.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that question and your response. I'm sure you weren't alone in having those questions. Yeah, let's see. On a related note, Leah Johnson wrote a question in the chat, and I'm wondering if you'd like to ask your question yourself, you can unmute and feel free to do so, or I can read it for you if you'd like.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. 1 second. So my question was, I'm just going to read it how I wrote it in the chat. So while your version, the NJPS, is seeking to be inclusive to the readers of the same age, would that not be considered exclusive of the way that God has chosen to identify himself in scripture? If it's about inclusivity, should we be accepting of how God has chosen to identify himself, regardless of how that makes the reader feel? That's my question, because I actually joined this with an curious to what you would say, because I personally had no issue with God being a male. I believe that he's chosen to identify as male, and therefore I will personally continue to respect and honor that. But I was curious what you would say if he has chosen to identify as male. Is it not exclusive to that in an attempt to make us just quote unquote like feel better or more connected?
Well, I think that's a question, Leah, that's essential to this kind of interpretation. Some translation does aim to bring the reader to the text, and other translation aims to bring the text to the reader. We're kind of trying to do both, which is the middle ground that JPS takes. So, my answer to that is that it is a matter of academic debate, ongoing, as to what God's gender is. So stating that it's one gender or another or multiple, we at this point don't have a lot of evidence. And so I think that the strategy and the goal is to stay open to God's revelation, whatever it is. And what God's revelation is to us might look different in 40 years from now from what it looks like today. So that's, at this point, we don't have the evidence saying that it's a matter of belief. And Jewish tradition is Jewish theology holds that God does not have one gender, that God has no body, that there are many pieces to that, and so that's why representing God with gender seems idolatrous to some of us. I see.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Right. The let's see. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're
Hi,
calling on
Professor
me?
Allen.
Yeah, thank you. I want to ask something that may go a little beyond most of the questions and see how you respond and if you agree or disagree that this reflects what you've presented. What I want to raise is a question of hermeneutics, different hermeneutical approaches to how we interpret scripture and other texts, as informed by linguistic, cultural, and anthropological and other studies, which would say, as far as we know, as you said, going back, doing a critical reading of what we take to be the original or the earliest scriptures or text, what we find is that, in fact, the language used in many ways, going back thousands of years, is very hierarchical. And in terms of gender and many other hierarchical relations. And what this expresses is not God or some supernatural or other, it expresses how human beings experienced and expressed themselves and constructed these texts, often pointing to realities beyond the text. But the language that's being used and the scriptures, it's not something fixed. It's open-ended, it's dynamic, it's part of an ongoing process that was constituted often by very patriarchal societies and patriarchal language and other dominant power relations. And so what you're involved in right now as part of this open-ended dynamic process is how can you purify that text, which is grounded, but you're also doing something new, speaking to the contextualized situatedness in which we are living today. So I wonder, does this accurately describe what you're doing, or are you doing something different?
I think what you're saying describes what we're doing. I'm not sure I understood all of it.
Mm-hmm.
Because because the language of Bible study has many, many layers, and what I yes, I mean, I think it does describe it. I mean, I don't think there's anything to add to that. I mean, I think you said it eloquently.
Professor Allen has a habit of doing that kind of thing around here. Yeah, you've met Doug now.
Well,
let's.
I say thank you for describing it this way, because I think it's you know, I think it captures a lot of the complexity of what the process is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there was also an, I'm sorry, Professor Helen, did you have any follow-up at all with that, or?
No, I think, well, thank you. I think though, in that open-ended way, what it means in terms of like the previous comment and so forth is that there is no one fixed, absolute, correct interpretation. So in a sense, we're involved in this ongoing dialogue and discussion and trying to, all of our approaches are perspectival in that sense, but that doesn't end. In other words, it doesn't mean you wind up with this total relativism, anything goes. You can be a sexist, not a sexist, a racist, not a racist, and that it's just your individual subjective opinion. So I think, what you're doing is good in that sense, is that you're engaging people. And I like that there was a certain humility to what you were saying, namely, here's the best we could do.
Yeah.
And join us in that project and so forth. So I appreciated that.
Thank you.
Okay. So we had a comment in the chat from Catherine Knowles. And I wonder, Catherine, I'll just give you the opportunity if you'd like to say your comment yourself, or if you'd rather, I can read it for us. Oh, okay, all right, I will do so. I will go ahead and read it. So, so Catherine wrote, for me, God is so much bigger than the limited gender terms human pin on them. Humans try to limit God, who is so beyond our comprehension, let alone our small categories. Also, as a woman, and recognizing and accepting that even human beings, let alone the divine, are bigger than the limited gender terms, reading the text in a form that is more universally recognized, and that God is freed from those limitations is, I think, wonderful. That's Catherine in the chat. So as we say at academic conferences, more of a comment than a question, but a welcome comment. Yeah. Yeah, let's see. So are there any other questions before I have a last one also from Catherine, and maybe I'll just sort of, I'll preempt things by just asking it now. When will the book be released? When can we get our hands on this thing?
So this is early. This is really early. These are early days. You really are the first group of people to see this, aside from on social media or at SBL. It will be on Safaria, available digitally for free, in portions, Torah first, Nevi'im next, then Ketuvim. In this year, this spring, actually, I believe Safaria is putting the Torah on relatively soon. And this is expected to be in print. It is in production right now at the typesetter in the fall of 2023.
A follow-up question on that. So yeah, Safari is a great place to get the text, and like you said, it will be in print, so you can buy the JPS Tanakh. What about, I think the JPS translation is used for Etz Chaim, but a very old one. Are there plans for other publications that use the JPS translations to be updated as well?
Well, if there are any RA members or anybody who wants to tell the RA that they should license this for their next version of Etz Chaim, that would be great. I don't know what's going to happen with that. That's kind of a publisher question, beyond my scope at the moment.
but an obviously good question, I think. Yeah, I mean, one thing that comes through pretty clearly from your presentation of the work here is an attention to not only the kind of the scholarly accuracy and maybe the way things speak to a contemporary English speaker and reader, and all of that, but also the way this language sounds, right? It seems pretty clear to me that you have you've had an ear for the liturgical use of these texts.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
that's and that invites, of course, the next question is, well, what about liturgical uses of the text, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I love to think about these things. I mean, liturgists have there are a number of prayer books in the progressive denominations of Judaism that already have their own alternative liturgy that is and creative liturgy. I'm not sure. I mean, it would be wonderful. The JPS 85 edition is also licensed in to Oxford. So it's Oxford's Anchor Bible. No, I don't know if it's the Anchor Bible, but the Oxford Jewish Study Bible and a number of other books there. So yeah, it's, a lot of people have said, well, what's taken you so long? And other people are just absolutely outraged. So we'll see. It's very exciting and a little nerve-wracking. See what's going to happen.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Anyone with any experience in publishing in any capacity can appreciate the nerve-wracking nature of this kind of thing, because yeah, you never really know until it's out there, and then the reviews come in, and we you see what people think, and
right.
Yeah. And the amount of time, the kind of impatience with how long it's taken, you probably saw me. I just start laughing at that, right? Like, I mean, this is weighty stuff, right? I mean, you're talking about a revised translation of the entire Hebrew Bible. This only happens, once a generation, right?
Yes.
If that.
Yeah.
So
right.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those measure twice, cut once kinds of enterprises, right? Like,
Absolutely.
you gotta have a
way to
lot
put
of
it.
conversations before something like this goes to print. Yeah.
And we were very disciplined in terms of the amount of time it took us. It wasn't a 30-year process for us. It was more like actually, if you count the Torah prototype, I would say it was maybe an 18-year process, maybe even 22 years. So,
Yeah.
with all the parties who were doing the work. So, yeah, it has been undergone with no small amount of humility and respect and care and trepidation. And it's wonderful to be able to speak with you about it. Do you think that
Yeah. So is maybe a final question, comment, or would you like to return to like your bonus examples, or I don't know, it feels sort of like I'm I'm almost asking for an encore, I guess.
We can let's do one bonus.
Yeah, okay, all right, cool.
Yeah, so we have one bonus, and that's going to be Proverbs 31.
All right, yeah.
So Eshet Hayel, woman of valor, is a text that is used quite a bit in Jewish settings, certainly. Not only is it in traditional, or let's say in practicing households, it can be used on Friday nights as part of the Shabbat blessings, and it's also used to eulogize women. Still, it has been in practice for that for a long time. So the interesting thing about this, and it's kind of off topic, which is why it's a bonus, is that the JPS 1985 edition was a product of its times. And so Eshet Hayel, which is really woman of strength, was translated in the 1950s or 60s as a capable wife. Now that's fine, but it's so much a product of its time. So one of the things that we also did was we modernized a few of the terms just because their meaning in the vernacular changed since it was last published. So we decided to go to something a little closer to the Hebrew that we felt reflected our times too, and translate it as how precious is a woman of substance. So I just thought that was kind of nice to report on. There are some really interesting surprises in here that people will find. That this is one of my favorites.
Yeah. No, I think I can. Well, I get a pale reflection of maybe why. In some respects it's a subtle change, but boy, woman of substance is miles apart from capable wife. Yeah, right. And the two are not mutually exclusive by any stretch.
Absolutely.
But the new language is pretty clearly more inclusive. And I find it interesting, as you mentioned, and you've mentioned this many times all evening, how this choice is both strikes the ear today in a better way, right? But is also maybe more accurately reflecting of the Hebrew. And that's where the project of bringing this to a modern audience meets up with the deep scholarship, right? And that's just wonderful. As an academic, I get very excited about that. So yeah, thank you.
This was nice to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a lovely place maybe to end our conversation for the moment, to pause our conversation. Yeah. We've been invited, of course, to continue the conversation, I think, into the indefinite future, because that's what this kind of work is all about. So thank you, Rabbi Lieberman. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time out to talk Tanakh with us on a Tuesday evening. Again, if you're anywhere around here in UMaine, as the snow flies, Well, and actually the snow's flying a lot of places these days. Yeah, again, thank you. Take care. And
Pleasure and an honor.
yeah, no, thank you. All right. Good night.
Good night.
Yeah.